to do a little bit of Philippians for us. He was able to do the last part of chapter 3, and we're getting into chapter 4. There's only 4 chapters in Philippians. We're going to cover just a very few verses this morning. We're not going to cover a lot of chapter 4, but there's a little detour there, a little kind of side issue that Paul tackles, and I want to kind of get into that because I think it has some relevance for where we're at today. It's important as you think about Philippians and that whole book that there's 2 different kinds, well, there's more than that, but just for argument's sake, 2 different kinds of ways a lot of times the Bible will go. Sometimes the Bible tries to make it extremely one point. You know, the whole book is heading one direction, and you'll have little stories and little things like that, but for the most part, there's one point being made all the way through. Then other times, like the book of Proverbs, each chapter may not relate to the next chapter. And I think Philippians is not like that. I think Philippians, the whole book, he's been making one point. He's been trying to accomplish one big objective. And it was a verse we talked about really early in Philippians, verse 1:6. He says, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. The day of Jesus Christ, of course, is Judgment Day. It's when you have to stand before God one day. And he's saying, Paul is, that at first I'm confident about this. I mean, I believe it. I know it in my heart. I feel it in my bones. That God, who started with you where you were at, has plans for you to take you someplace else. And I think it's really important as Christians that we don't ever lose sight of that dream, because it's an important thing, this notion that God's taken us someplace, that we're not helpless, right? And it's possible that you were a surprise to your parents, but you were not a surprise to God. And he knew you were coming and had a plan for your life. It says he lays out all the works for our days before even one of them came to be. He's got plans for you. And Paul says in Philippians, the big plan is to take you to completion, which means that the who you were supposed to be, the life you've always wanted, the you at your best, walking hand in hand with God at the very end. Now, all of us at different times get sideways in that thing. All of us at different times wonder if it's worth it to hang in with God as he continues to take us someplace. And Philippians is about that. It's worth it. It's worth it. You want to hang in here, it's worth it. The payoff is going to be great. Paul uses himself as an illustration of that. He talks about how right now he says, I'm in jail and I'm being treated really hard, but I'm convinced that God's taken me somewhere for me to live as Christ, die as gain. He uses Jesus as an example of that. He says, Jesus, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the nature of a servant, and that God exalted him to the highest place. Then there's the verse that Gabe read last week. He says, I forget what's behind, and I strain towards what's ahead. I know that I've made some mistakes in my past. I know there's some things that I wish I could do over again. If I could, I would. And not just bad things, but there's some good things in my past that I put ahead of God. They were good in and of themselves, but they weren't good because I put them ahead of God. And Paul says, I forget about all that stuff. I'm putting it behind me. I'm straining towards what God has for me, because it's this completion. The very first thing he established in the book, it's worth going for. And when you think about some of the things in Philippians where he challenges people, he a lot of times in Philippians, more than some other books, emphasizes the work that we need to do. He in chapter 127 says, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of Christ. And in 2:5 he says, think like Jesus. And 2:12, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Chapter 3, press on towards the goal. I mean, a lot of times Paul will use that kind of language. We're going someplace. And you need to give everything you have to going someplace. A couple weeks ago, my family and I got to go on a vacation. I enjoy getting away. That's fun. And we rented a car, which is kind of cool because all our cars are kind of crappy. And it was kind of neat to have a car that really would do what you wanted it to do and had some pep to it. And we're flying down the road. And boy, it was such a fun night to drive. Everything was going great. And then we hit something like this, if I can get it up here. We were doing so good. And then we hit something like that. And at first, you don't even know that it's coming. You just know everybody's slowing down. And I know other people are better Christians than I am about this thing, but I start talking to the windshield when that happens. I don't know if any of you do that or not. Like come on, what's going on? And I'm muttering to myself. And And Julia, hey, it's not time for road rage. I'm not having road rage, Julia, and I am, but a little bit I am. And I'm getting a little ticked off about it because we were making such great time, and then we suddenly slow down. And maybe it may be that, maybe something, this is China. You probably haven't driven in China, but it can be just packed like this. All the lanes are full and there's no getting around, and you just got to slow down and deal with it. And there's a science to it. There's a science to traffic that the idea that if the first person slows down a little, the person who's right behind them will slow down a little more. And so on and so on and so on. So you might be going down the interstate and run into some knot of traffic and actually come to a full stop on the interstate, and you're telling the people beside you, well, I can't believe what's happening. We'll see here in a minute. I'm sure something pretty bad must have went on. And you get up there and there's nothing. Right? You've had that experience, and there's nothing. It's just because everybody slowed down a little more. By the time it got to you, you had to stop because you're so frustrating. When you're making great time. I have a real pet peeve. If you're in the passing lane, you should be passing. Right? I'm just. And I pound the steering wheel. It just seems like the most elemental part of courtesy on the road, that if you're in the passing lane, you should be making good time. If you're not making good time, get over here with the rest of us. And so I'll be stuck behind somebody and I can't get around, and I was doing so good, and now something's come up and I have to slow down and I have to deal with it. Well, that picture, right? That's what I want you to have in your head when we talk about Philippians here, because Paul, as he's been working through Philippians, Philippians chapter 4, we're just going to look really mostly at these three verses. We're going to, a couple verses to illustrate that, but mainly just three verses today. Paul says, therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. So everything he's talking about here, therefore, means you want to look back at what he's already said. In this way, the stuff he's already been talking about. So everything he's been talking about, Paul says, this is what you want to do. God's taking you someplace. We're going to completion. God has a plan for your life. Don't give up. He's taking you someplace. Be strong. Detours are going to come your way for sure, right? Slow traffic occasionally is going to happen. You might get ticked off, but keep your eyes on the prize. Keep focused on what it is that we're going to do. Therefore, he says, in this way, this is what you want to do. And then he changes. And again, most of Philippians has been, it's stuff that relates to everybody at all times, no matter what. But he takes off in chapter 4, verse 2, and he says, I plead with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche. And these are names we don't have anymore anywhere in the world. They're names that have fallen out of style, but they're both feminine names. He's talking to two women here, and there's a female pronoun later, so we know there are two women he's talking about. And apparently these ladies had gotten in this gigantic fight. And I'm going to go through all this, and I'm going to come back and talk about it. So let me, okay. So I ask you, my true companion, to help these women who have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers. Their names are in the book of life. So we don't know for sure who these ladies are, Euodia and Syntyche, but they were important to Paul. And they weren't just two people. They were leaders in the church. They were important people in the church. They were people who accomplished things, right, with Paul. And now they've gotten in this big fight, and this big fight is causing all these troubles. In fact, if you read through Philippians, there's a lot of verses about being like-minded and don't get divided and stay focused. And you wonder if maybe this argument here was part of the reason why he wrote the whole letter. That these two ladies who were both really important in the church had gotten in such a disagreement that it was starting to wreck everything that the church was doing. I mean, they weren't able to and truthfully, you know what that's like. You do. Maybe in a big family get-together, and they've always been fun, but last year your aunt and uncle got divorced, and now they're both going to come, or maybe this sister's mad at that brother, and so you go to the family get-together, and like there's this tension hanging over everything. And they're not talking about it. In fact, the people who are mad are doing everything they can to be on different sides of the house, but you just feel it, I mean, this disagreement they're having is bleeding into everything else you're talking about. And that certainly can happen at church. And that's what I'm assuming was happening with this Euodia and this Syntyche, that the fight that they had gotten into had become such a big fight that people were kind of being forced to take sides. I mean, this was an era before social media, so they were having to work hard just to it's easier on Facebook to get a big stir going, but they were getting it. So Paul says, I plead with Euodia. And I plead with Syntyche. And again, just as grammar, he doesn't have to say plead twice. He could just say, I plead with Euodia and Syntyche. But it's like he wants to make sure that everybody knows, I don't blame any of these. I don't blame one of these more than the other. I just plead with both of them. This is so crazy important. He says, I plead with both of these ladies to be of the same mind. Now what he's saying here is that one or both of these ladies then is going to have to lose this argument, right? I mean, I don't know what the argument was, but what he's saying is that one of these ladies is going to have to lose, or maybe both, because I want you to be of the same mind. And Paul has talked this way before. He's talked this way in Philippians 1. He talks this way in Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 6, he says it's better to be wronged than to lose somebody. And here with Euodia and Syntyche, I just plead with you to give in. And he says, I want you to do it in the Lord. So what he's challenging these two women is whatever argument they were having, and it may be a really righteous sounding argument, whatever argument it was they were having, you need to know there's bigger fish to fry here. And you want to keep God's perspective in mind. I don't know what kind of church fights you have been exposed to over the years. There's all sorts of different church fights. Sometimes it's about the building and how it's constructed or who gets to use it. Sometimes it's about the worship service and how that goes, or how long or short or loud it is. Sometimes it's about the kids' ministries. People can get real mad about that. Sometimes it's a budget thing. We're spending too much on missions or not enough on missions or whatever. Sometimes it can be about a minister. That preacher thinks he runs the whole church, or a really powerful family. That family thinks they run the whole church. And so you think about different church arguments that go on, right? Paul's saying, I plead with you, these two ladies, be of the same mind and do it for God's sake, which means you're going to have to lose. Because none of those things that we think are so critically important are most important. The most important thing is the thing he's been talking about all the way through this. God has taken regular people to completion. God's taken regular people on a journey, and we can't get on some detour here with this argument. And not just with these two ladies here to give in that way. He says, I'm also asking you, my true companion, and we don't know who this is, my true companion. Some Bibles will actually translate that phrase, my true companion, into a Greek word like it was a name. And it could be that it could be a whole other, he could be talking about specifically a certain dude, and my true companion is what his name meant in Greek. That's possible. But more than likely, this is probably the head leader at the church in Philippi. Probably it's the guy to whom Paul was writing the letter, whoever he was writing the letter to. I'm asking you, my true companion, the guy I'm writing the letter to, I want you to help these women. Now, one thing that's interesting to me, and I don't know if this will be interesting to you or not, but you got to put up with it, I'm preaching, is that as I went through different parts of the country, each part of the country, even though we're all Americans, there's a certain dynamic about things, right? Like in the South, we lived in the South for a long time, there's this courtesy that goes over everything. Everybody has this sort of politeness. You may not be polite. You may not like the other person, but there's a certain politeness that's just seen as something that you do. We went out to California, independence was the big thing. Most people lived in California, especially in where we lived, they hadn't been born there. A lot of people were transplants, or their families were transplants, not very many generations before. And so everybody's kind of on their own, and that was really cool. But here, and I grew up here, I grew up in Paoli. One of the things that stands out about southern Indiana is that one of the cultural touchstones is that we all mind our own business. Just mind your own business. Okay, what Paul's challenging this dude, my true companion, is don't mind your own business. I want you to stick your nose into this. I want you to help these women. I want you to speak to them. I want you to challenge them. I want you to encourage them to get through this thing. Now, it's not hard to imagine how many different ways that could go south, right? You stick your nose into that thing, they may not appreciate it. They may tell you to to get lost, or something a little more firm than that. They might tell you to leave them alone. It could cost you a friendship, especially if you take a side. If you say, well, Yodia, you're probably wrong, Syntyche's more right, or whatever, then you could lose a friendship on that. But Paul says it's worth it. You've got to help these ladies because they've contended at my side in the cause of the gospel. And it's always the gospel that's the main thing, right? It's always the gospel that's the main thing. Rick Atchley is a minister in Texas, a Church of Christ minister. Says it's always wrong when Christians want to be right more than they want to be Christ, or more than they want to be like Christ. It's always wrong when Christians want to be right, and they lose sight of these bigger things. I'm going to get more into this here in a second and challenge you on it, but I think that's absolutely true. I have a Facebook friend, and my Facebook friend they posted something that was another friend. I'm assuming, I don't know if they knew him personally or if it's one of those things that went viral. I never found out. But it's a waitress, and she's had a post about her night that night, and she's got a mask on because you got to wear masks for the waitresses now, and the mask says Black Lives Matter. And she says she had served this table earlier, and the table was a big meal, and a lot of people were there. And at the end of it, it took a lot of her night. And when she was done, and she came back to get the credit card slip there, where it said tip and had a blank space, the people had written in all lives matter, because she had that mask that says Black Lives Matter. And they wrote in on the tip, all lives matter, and they didn't give her any money. Now, as far as just being right goes, they won that argument. They got the last word. They said all lives matter, and then they hit the road. But as far as being a witness, I mean, if any of those people ever see this waitress in town again, I mean, they have no witness at all, and they will never get that back. And so in the pursuit of being right, you lost somebody. And as Christians, man, we just can't ever do that. It doesn't really matter what the little issues are. I mean, if it's not about Jesus and about Jesus really directly, we need to learn how to be more Christ-like about this thing. And sometimes that means that we have to lose. It's a classic. I don't push you guys hard, probably as hard as I should, to memorize Scripture, but a Scripture that would be worth you memorizing, right? A verse that would be worth your time to have this one in the data banks is Matthew chapter 18. This verse here, verse 15, this verse here from Jesus, he's speaking, could solve 90% of your problems in life. Jesus says, if your brother or sister sins, and brother or sister here, he's thinking Christian brother or sister, not necessarily family member, but another Christian. If your brother or sister sins, you go point out their fault just between the two of you. And if they listen to you, then you've won them over. It's so profound, all this stuff. I know that's real simple. It's a great verse for people who say the Bible doesn't make sense. This makes a ton of sense. If somebody sins against you, odds are they don't know they did it. I mean, you think about somebody who said something mean to you, or they took some little shot, or they didn't invite you to the party when they invited other people, and your first thought is, they knew what they were doing. They knew it. I can just imagine them sitting there planning how they were going to hurt me. Most of the time, people don't do that. Most of the time, they don't even know they did the wrong thing. So if your brother or sister has sinned against you, Jesus' advice is to go and tell them. Point out their fault just between the two of you. This is another place where sometimes I'll make mistakes. Sometimes I want to talk to 2 or 3 people ahead of time to make sure I'm right. And what I pretend like I'm doing is getting my story straight, but what I'm really doing is rehearsing my story. Trying to make it sound like I'm a bigger hero in this thing than I am, and that the other person's a bigger villain than they are. And Jesus says, don't do that. Don't talk to anybody else. Just go talk to them. Just the 2 of you. And if they listen to you, then you've won them over. And that's the goal, right? I mean, I want to win them over. I want us to be friends again. I want us to be brother and sister again. I want us to be tight again. Now, I can think of a bunch of reasons why this might not work. And in fact, some of those things make me scared to trust Jesus. You know, when we talk about having faith in Jesus, it means a faith to do what he says to do. Sometimes I'm kind of scared to do this. Because I know that if I go point out their fault, it might just make them mad. If I go point out their fault, it might make it worse. They might laugh. They might give me one of those half apologies. Oh, well, if that offended you, I'm sorry. And they've not really said they're sorry about anything. But this really does work most of the time. And just because it doesn't work 1 out of 10 times doesn't mean you shouldn't do it the other 9. This works. This is advice from Jesus that absolutely works, and it would transform most families, most churches, most couples. If they sin, just talk about it. Again, with the goal of trying to win them over. If they won't listen, you're taking along somebody else. You're trying to get some witnesses. And again, it's not witnesses of the conflict. It's witnesses of you talking to each other. You're looking for somebody here who is a calm person, who doesn't take sides very easy, who wants to get to the truth. Somebody older and wiser, perhaps. And you and the person you're frustrated with and them sit down. Now, it's possible before you get to this step, when you talk to them the first time and you see, it's possible you're going to decide, you know what, it's not worth it to go and do this second thing. And that's okay. It is okay. If you think about it and say, you know what, I'm just going to let it go. That's a great idea. You should do that. That's wonderful. It's just most people don't do it. They say they're doing it, but they don't. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody and they're telling you about how ticked off they were at somebody or how somebody really hurt them, and as they're getting through, you say, man, it sounds like you're pretty upset about that still. Oh, no, I'm over it. But they're not over it, right? They've had this 20-minute story about how they're not over it, right? So if you can let it go, do that. But if you can't, you can't. And if you can't, he says, take somebody else along. Because remember, the goal again is to win them over. He said, if they still won't listen, take it to the church. And what he's talking about here is the leadership of the church, the older, wiser people who you know are the pillars of the church. And if they refuse to listen, well, then you've got to move on. Now, I should mention that Jesus says we're to love pagans and we're to love tax collectors. So you still have to love them. You still got to be courteous. But it's okay at a point. If they don't want to be friends, we're not going to be everybody's best friend. And that's painful and it hurts, but it's the truth. We're not going to be everybody's best friend. And if they don't want any part of you after you've done all those different things, then move on. You're allowed. And remember, the goal of all of it is to win them over. When we lived in San Diego, I know I've told this story before, and I'm sorry ahead of time, but when we lived in San Diego, it was always 6 to 8 lanes of just heavy traffic all the time. And we didn't live in San Diego, we were close, and I was up there at a hospital visit, and I was going from one place to another, and I pulled out on the interstate during rush hour, and I cut somebody off. And I know that I cut them off because they were helpful to let me know that. Behind me there, they were honking, and I could see him pounding on his steering wheel and just ticked off. And he wanted to pass me right away. But he couldn't because it was just bumper to bumper in the lane beside us. So he's just on my bumper, and I can see him back there barking at the windshield and everything like that. And I'm thinking, who would do something like that? But, anyway. But he's ticked off. And so after a little spot opens up, he slides over in the other lane there. He slows down when he gets beside me, rolls his window down, makes a hand gesture to let me know that he wants to communicate something that way, and explains in really clear terms where I was stupid. And then he drives off. Now, in terms of what Jesus said, he did most of this. He pointed out my fault just between the two of us. He went straight to me. He didn't talk to anybody else first. He was very clear about his side and about how I had done the wrong thing. The only place he messed up was this last part. He wasn't really trying to win me over. When you're trying to do this thing, remember your big goal is to win them over. And this really does work. If you go in with that attitude, I just want us to be close again. You'd just be stunned how many people are hungry to respond to something like that. So that's what Jesus says. And that's what Yodia and Syntyche should have done. And they're too important. Whatever the argument was between these ladies, it's just not worth losing somebody over. Then he goes on, and I'm not going to spend much time here, but I just want to hit it because we're going to talk about these verses next week. We're going to start here next week, but remember, this is right after the part about Yodia and Syntyche. It's right after those two ladies' argument. He says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." So what's that got to do with the other thing? Well, man, we're a joyful people. We're not bitter. We're not angry. The song we sang at the beginning, "I'll fly away," one day when this world finally takes your life, whether it's the coronavirus or some cancer or whether you die in your bed 60 years from now, you're going to fly into his arms. This world has nothing on you. Whether you're rich or poor or good looking or not so good looking, we have lots of reasons to rejoice in God. He's taken us someplace. So don't get sidetracked. He says, let your gentleness be evident to all. Man, that's got to be the goal for all of us. I just want to be kind. He says, don't be anxious about anything. And you know when you're stressed and somebody's hurt you and you just circle it over and over and over in your head, well, I wonder what they meant by that, or I wonder why they're thinking that, or I wonder what's in you. And you don't do that, Paul says. He says, just present your request to God. And when you do it, he says, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your heart and mind. I know this sermon may not relate to everybody here. There may be some people here who are not really having any conflict with anybody. And it's just not something you're dealing with. The journey that you're on, whatever journey it is going pretty smooth. Wide open road, and nothing feels good like wide open road. But for any of you who are dealing with some of this, and there's a handful of, or maybe one very specific conflict that just looms large in your mind all the time, all this stuff is true. And our faith is not just fire insurance to save us from hell when we die. It's something to make us live a transformed, a complete life now. And you don't have to live the same way everybody else does. And you don't have to fall into all the same holes everybody else does. And so if you're going through some of that right now, I just want you to know I'm praying for you. And I want to challenge you to dig real deep, to think about what relationships you might need to repair, what people you might need to speak to, who you might need to pray about, and ask God to move. Because this peace of God, which transcends all understanding, is much too precious a gift to let go. I didn't know how much that Trent's doing communion meditation. I didn't realize how much his communion meditation and what I'm talking about relates. And he's going to go into this in some more detail. But this notion that, at a funeral, I had to go to a funeral a couple weeks ago, and they talked about how this guy who had died, man, he just always thought of other people. And we mythologize people sometimes, and we make them better than they really were. But I knew this guy, and he really was that kind of guy. He always put other people first. Don't you want that to be what they say about you? It'll be kind of funny, I suppose, if at my funeral they say, you don't make him mad. That may be kind of funny for a minute. And again, I'll be in heaven either way, I guess, so I won't be too upset about it. But I mean, if I really could have my life go the way I want it to go, I would hope that people would say those things about me, that, man, he's always put other people first. So if that's you today and you need some prayer for that, let me pray for you.